Part 1: The Last Ember. The Galactic Council had been in mourning for 300 years. Every species across the known universe remembered the great cosmic dragons who once flew between stars and galaxies. These ancient beings were made of pure stellar fire, and they had lived for millions of years before any other intelligent species had even learned to walk. They were the peacekeepers of the old galaxy, and their wisdom was beyond anything the younger races could understand. But they were gone now. They had vanished during the terrible conflict known as the Silence Wars, and no one had seen them since. Their eggs had been scattered across thousands of worlds, but every single one had gone cold and dark. Scientists from every corner of the universe had studied these eggs and declared them dead. They were extinct, and the galaxy had lost its greatest protectors forever. Ambassador of the Collective stood in the center of the Great Council chamber. Her body was made of living crystal that pulsed with soft blue light, and today that light was dim with sadness. She had spent her entire life searching for even one viable egg. She had traveled to distant planets and explored ancient ruins. She had consulted with the oldest beings in existence and read texts that were written before her species had even evolved. But she had found nothing. Every egg she discovered was cold and lifeless. High Chancellor sat upon his massive throne and looked down at the assembled representatives from 1,000 different worlds. He was ancient even by galactic standards, his body towering and dark like a living mountain. When he spoke, his voice echoed through the chamber like thunder rolling across an endless plain. "We have searched long enough," said slowly. "They are gone and they will not return. We must honor their memory and find our own way forward. Let this be the final word on the matter." Wanted to argue, but she knew it was pointless. The evidence was clear and her hope was running out. Perhaps it was time to accept the truth and stop chasing ghosts across the stars. But the universe has a strange sense of timing. At that very moment, on a small blue planet in a quiet corner of the Milky Way galaxy, something wonderful was about to happen. Earth was not considered an important world by galactic standards. The humans who lived there had only recently discovered how to travel faster than light, and they were still being evaluated for potential membership in the Galactic Council. Most alien species considered humans to be young, chaotic, and overly emotional. They fought wars among themselves and made decisions based on feelings rather than logic. They were not taken very seriously. Daniel Hayes knew nothing about any of this. He was a 32-year-old emergency room nurse who lived in a small apartment in Denver, Colorado. He had just finished a brutal 12-hour shift at the hospital, and his entire body ached with exhaustion. He had saved 3 lives that night and lost 1, and the weight of it all pressed down on his shoulders like a physical burden. On his way home, Daniel passed by a weekend flea market that was still open despite the late hour. He was too tired to think clearly, but something made him stop and wander through the rows of tables covered with old books, vintage clothing, and random trinkets. One booth in the corner caught his attention. A strange old man with thick glasses was selling what he called unusual geological specimens. Daniel looked over the dusty collection of rocks and minerals without much interest. But then he spotted 3 egg-shaped stones sitting together in a wooden box. They were about the size of grapefruits, and their surfaces swirled with colors that seemed to move and shift when he looked at them. Reds and golds and deep purples danced beneath what looked like a thin shell of polished stone. He picked one up and almost dropped it in surprise. It was warm, not just slightly warm, but genuinely warm like a living thing. "How much for these 3?" Daniel asked. The old man squinted at the eggs and shrugged. $20 for all of them. Nobody else wanted them. They give people the creeps for some reason. Daniel did not find them creepy at all. He found them beautiful and strangely comforting. He paid the $20 and carried the eggs home in a paper bag, thinking they would make nice decorations for his empty apartment. When he got home, Daniel was so exhausted that he did not even make it to his bedroom. He collapsed onto his old couch and lay there staring at the ceiling. Without really thinking about it, He took the 3 eggs out of the bag and placed them on his chest. Their warmth seeped through his shirt and into his tired body, and something about that heat was deeply soothing. Daniel closed his eyes and let out a long breath. He thought about the people he had helped that night. He thought about the elderly woman who had cried and thanked him for holding her hand, while the doctors worked to save her husband. He thought about the little boy who had been so scared until Daniel told him silly jokes to make him laugh. He thought about the man who had not made it, and he said a silent prayer for that man's family. These thoughts filled Daniel's mind as sleep pulled him under. The eggs rested on his chest, rising and falling with each breath he took. They absorbed his warmth and something else too, something that could not be measured by any scientific instrument. They absorbed the compassion in his heart, the genuine care he felt for strangers, the love he carried for people he would never see again. That night, Daniel dreamed of fire and stars. He dreamed of vast wings spreading across galaxies and eyes that held the wisdom of ages. He dreamed of voices calling out to him from across an impossible distance, voices that were filled with hope and gratitude and joy. When he woke up the next morning, the eggs were no longer eggs. 3 small creatures were curled up on his chest, sleeping peacefully. They had scales that shimmered with the colors of nebulae and tiny wings folded against their bodies. Their breath was warm like a gentle fire, and their small hearts beat in rhythm with his own. Daniel stared at them in complete shock. He had no idea what they were or where they had come from. He only knew that they were beautiful and helpless, and that somehow, impossibly, they belonged to him. He named them before he even got off the couch. The one with the silver and blue scales would be Luna. The one with the golden and orange scales would be Comet. And the smallest one, with the deep red and purple scales, would be Blaze. Daniel did not know that he had just done the impossible. He did not know that the entire galaxy had given up hope of ever seeing again. He did not know that his simple act of falling asleep with warmth in his heart had awakened beings that had been waiting for 300 years. All he knew was that he had 3 new friends, and he was going to take care of them no matter what. Part 2. The Impossible Discovery. 3 weeks passed, and Daniel Hayes had grown used to his strange new life. The 3 hatchlings had grown from the size of kittens to the size of small cats, and they followed him everywhere he went. Luna was the quietest of the 3, preferring to sleep curled around his neck like a warm scarf. Comet was playful and curious, always exploring every corner of the apartment and knocking things off shelves. Blaze was bold and protective, growling at anyone who came too close to Daniel, and watching the world with eyes that burned like tiny stars. Daniel had called in sick to work for the first week, too confused and amazed to do anything but stare at his new companions. He had searched the internet for answers but found nothing. No animal on Earth looked anything like these creatures. They were clearly not from this planet, but Daniel had no way of understanding what that meant. He fed them raw meat at first, but they seemed to prefer absorbing heat instead. They would curl up near the stove when he cooked or press themselves against the warm water pipes in the bathroom. Sometimes they would open their tiny mouths and breathe out small flames, which had caused Daniel to buy 3 fire extinguishers just in case. The hatchlings slept on his chest every night, just as they had on that first morning. They seemed to need his presence, his warmth, his heartbeat. When he tried to put them in a box or a pet bed, they would cry out in distress until he picked them up again. So he stopped trying and simply accepted that he now slept with 3 baby dragons on his chest. Daniel had no idea that far above the Earth, a science vessel called the Endless Dawn was entering the solar system. The ship was on a routine survey mission, gathering data about Earth and its inhabitants for the Galactic Council's records. Nobody on board expected to find anything remarkable. Humans were considered a young and unimportant species, interesting only because they were so new to interstellar travel. Science Officer was a young female with crystal skin that sparkled like diamonds in the ship's artificial light. She was monitoring the sensor array, when she noticed something that made her freeze in place. Three distinct energy signatures were coming from the planet's surface. They were signatures she had studied in her xenobiology classes, but had never expected to see in real life. Life signs, three of them, young ones barely hatched. Ran the scan again. Then she ran it a third time and a fourth time. The results were always the same. There were three living hatchlings on Earth. She turned to her commander with wide eyes and a trembling voice. "Commander Vex, you need to see this immediately." Commander Vex was a tall male with centuries of experience. He walked over to her station and studied the readings in complete silence. His crystal form began to pulse with bright blue light as the implications hit him. This was impossible. This was a miracle. This changed everything. Within the hour the Galactic Council had been, emergency sessions were called. Representatives from dozens of species demanded confirmation and then demanded explanations. How could eggs have hatched after 3 centuries? Why had this happened on Earth of all places? What did it mean for the future of the galaxy? Ambassador received the news in her private chambers. She had been preparing to give up, to accept that they were truly gone forever. But now she stood with tears of liquid crystal running down her face, overwhelmed by emotions she had never expected to feel again. Hope, joy, disbelief, gratitude. She immediately volunteered to lead the diplomatic mission to Earth. No one argued with her. Everyone knew how much this meant to her. The delegation arrived in Denver 3 days later. It consisted of Ambassador, Commander Vex, Science Officer, and 4 other specialists from different species. They had taken great care to appear non-threatening, but there was really no way to make 7 different aliens showing up at an apartment building seem normal. Daniel Hayes opened his door on that ordinary Tuesday afternoon and found himself face to face with beings from another world. There was a woman made of living crystal, a tall figure with gray skin and 4 arms, something that looked like a floating sphere of light, and several other creatures he could not even begin to describe. He stared at them for a long moment. They stared back at him. Nobody said anything. Then Luna poked her head out from behind Daniel's leg and chirped at the visitors. Comet scrambled up to sit on his shoulder, and Blaze climbed onto his head and spread her tiny wings in a display of protection. Ambassador's eyes went wide. She fell to her knees right there in the hallway, tears streaming down her crystal face. "The live," she whispered. "By all the stars in the heavens, the live." Daniel looked down at the alien ambassador kneeling before him, then looked at the 3 small dragons attached to various parts of his body. He had so many questions that he did not even know where to begin. "Would you like to come in?" he finally asked. "I just made coffee, but I am not sure if any of you drink coffee or if you drink anything at all." And that was how Daniel Hayes, an emergency room nurse from Denver, Colorado, became the most important human being in the history of the galaxy. He did not feel important. He felt confused and tired and slightly worried about whether his apartment was clean enough for alien visitors. But the hatchlings knew exactly what was happening. They could sense the joy and reverence coming from the strange beings in the hallway. They understood that their awakening was significant in ways their human guardian could not yet comprehend. Blaze settled on top of Daniel's head and purred like a small furnace. Luna pressed closer to his neck. Comet chirped happily from his shoulder. They were home, they were safe, they were loved. And that was all that mattered. Part 3: The Human Warmth. Daniel's small apartment had never been so crowded. 7 aliens sat in his living room, perched on his couch and chairs, and even floating near the ceiling. Ambassador had finally stopped crying, but her crystal form still pulsed with emotional light. The 3 hatchlings had positioned themselves protectively around Daniel, watching the visitors with curious but cautious eyes. "I do not understand," Daniel said for the 5th time. "You are telling me these little guys are some kind of ancient cosmic dragons that the whole galaxy thought were extinct?" Nodded slowly. They were the oldest beings in the known universe. They existed before my species evolved, before any of our species evolved. They were beings of pure stellar energy, born from the hearts of dying stars. For millions of years, they served as the peacekeepers and the wisdom keepers of the galaxy. And they all disappeared 300 years ago, Commander Vex added. During the Silence Wars, we found their eggs scattered across thousands of worlds, but every single one had gone dormant. We tried everything to wake them: heat chambers, energy infusions, artificial incubation environments. Nothing worked. The eggs remained cold and dead. Daniel looked down at Blaze, who was now curled in his lap and breathing out tiny puffs of warm smoke. But these eggs were not cold. They were warm when I found them. Science Officer leaned forward with intense curiosity. That is precisely what we need to understand. What did you do differently? How did you succeed where all of our advanced technology failed? Daniel shrugged helplessly. I did not do anything special. I was tired after work. I found the eggs at a flea market. I fell asleep with them on my chest because they were warm and comfortable. When I woke up, they had hatched. The aliens exchanged confused glances. Surely there had to be more to it than that. There had to be some scientific explanation, some special technique or process that the human had accidentally discovered. Over the next several days, and her team conducted extensive research. They set up monitoring equipment in Daniel's apartment and studied every aspect of his interaction with the hatchlings. They analyzed his body temperature, his brainwave patterns, his hormonal levels, and 100 other biological factors. They also brought in Dr. Lisa Martinez, a human who had been working with the Galactic Council for the past 2 years. She was one of the few humans who had extensive knowledge of alien species, and the Council trusted her expertise. Dr. Martinez spent a week observing Daniel and the hatchlings before she finally called a meeting with the alien delegation. She stood before them with her research notes, looking both excited and humbled by what she had discovered. I think I understand what happened, she began. The answer is actually quite simple, but its implications are profound. Everyone leaned in to listen. Eggs require a very specific combination of conditions to incubate, Dr. Martinez explained. First, they need the right temperature. Human body heat is almost exactly what they require, but that alone is not enough. Many species have attempted to incubate the eggs using artificial heat sources or even their own body heat. It never worked. Then what is the missing element? Asked. Dr. Martinez smiled. The eggs are empathic. They can sense the emotional state of their environment. They do not just need physical warmth. They need emotional warmth as well. They need to feel genuine compassion, unconditional care, and selfless love radiating from the being that holds them. She pulled up some data on her tablet. Daniel had just finished a 12-hour shift saving lives in an emergency room. He had held the hands of frightened patients. He had comforted grieving families. He had given everything he had to help complete strangers who he would never see again. When he fell asleep with those eggs on his chest, his heart was full of that compassion, and the eggs responded to it. Commander Vex frowned thoughtfully. But we have compassionate beings in our species as well. We have doctors and healers and caretakers. Why did our eggs never respond to them? Dr. Martinez nodded. That is the fascinating part. Humans have an unusually strong capacity for empathy. We bond quickly and deeply, even with strangers. We sacrifice ourselves for people we have never met. We adopt orphaned animals from completely different species and raise them as our own children. We cry at sad movies about fictional characters. Our emotional range is considered extreme by galactic standards. She paused to let that sink in. Most species find human emotionality to be a weakness. You consider us irrational and unstable, but they see it differently. They were searching for beings who could love unconditionally, without logic or self-interest. They were searching for beings whose hearts burn as bright as their own stellar fire. stood up slowly, her crystal form shimmering with new understanding. They were searching for warmth that comes from the soul, not just from the body. Exactly, Dr. Martinez confirmed, and they found it in humanity. Daniel had been listening quietly the whole time. He looked down at Luna, who was sleeping peacefully on his shoulder, and at Comet, who was chasing his own tail in circles on the floor, and at Blaze, who was watching the conversation with intelligent, fiery eyes. "So you are saying these eggs hatched because I cared about them?" he asked. "Not just them," Dr. Martinez replied. "The eggs sense that you care about everyone, that you would die for a stranger without hesitation, that your heart has no boundaries or conditions on its love. That is what woke them up after 300 years of silence." Daniel felt tears forming in his eyes. He was just a nurse. He was just a regular guy who tried to do his job well and help people when he could. He had never thought of himself as special or important. But apparently, to ancient cosmic dragons and the entire galactic community, that simple compassion was the rarest and most precious thing in the universe. Blaze climbed up onto his shoulder and nuzzled his cheek with her warm snout. She made a sound that was almost like purring, and Daniel could have sworn he felt something like gratitude radiating from her tiny body. "Well," he said softly, wiping his eyes, "I guess that explains why they refuse to sleep anywhere except on my chest." And despite the strangeness of it all, despite the aliens in his living room and the cosmic implications of what had happened, Daniel smiled. Because at the end of the day, he was still just a man who had found three creatures that needed love. And love was something he had plenty of. Part 4, The Council's Dilemma. News of the hatchlings spread across the galaxy like wildfire. Within days, every species in the known universe had heard the story. Ancient cosmic dragons, believed to be extinct for 3 centuries, had been awakened by a human, not by advanced technology or scientific expertise, but by the simple warmth of a compassionate heart. The reaction was mixed. Many species celebrated the news and saw it as a sign of hope for the future. They had been beloved peacekeepers, and their return could bring stability to a galaxy that had grown increasingly chaotic in their absence. These species looked at humanity with new respect and wondered if perhaps they had underestimated the young race all along. But others were not so pleased. The Empire had grown powerful during the 3 centuries since they disappeared. They were a militaristic species that valued strength and conquest above all else. In the old days, the dragons had kept them in check, preventing them from expanding their territory through force. Without they had built an empire that spanned hundreds of star systems. Ambassador of the Empire was not happy at all. He was a massive creature with dark scales and sharp teeth, and his eyes burned with cold calculation as he stood before the Galactic Council. His deep voice echoed through the chamber as he made his demands known. "These hatchlings are too important to be left in the care of a primitive human," declared. "They must be transferred to a proper research facility where they can be studied and protected by qualified beings. The fate of the galaxy cannot rest in the hands of one man from a backwards planet." Daniel stood at the center of the council chamber, feeling very small and very out of place. He had been brought here to speak on his own behalf, but the massive alien beings surrounding him made him feel like an ant among giants. Luna was curled around his neck, Comet sat on his left shoulder, and Blaze perched on his right shoulder with her wings spread in a display of defiance. "I understand your concerns," Daniel said, trying to keep his voice steady. "But these hatchlings are not objects to be transferred like property. They are living beings with their own feelings and choices. They chose to bond with me. They trust me. Taking them away would cause them tremendous distress." His lips curled into something like a sneer. "And what qualifies you to make decisions about ancient cosmic beings? You are a nurse. You change bandages and hold hands. You know nothing of galactic politics or the true importance of the—" Daniel felt a flash of anger but pushed it down. "I know how to care for those who need me. I know how to give comfort to the scared and hope to the hopeless. Maybe that is not important to you, but it seems to be important to them." He gestured to the three hatchlings, who were watching with obvious distrust. Blaze was growling softly, and small wisps of smoke rose from her nostrils. Ambassador stood up to speak in Daniel's defense. "We have studied the situation extensively. The hatchlings have formed an unbreakable bond with their human guardian. Separating them would be not only cruel but potentially dangerous. Are empathic beings. They respond to the emotional state of those around them. If they sense hostility or threat, they will defend themselves and their bonded partner." Dismissed her words with a wave of his clawed hand. "Then we will simply sedate them for transport. Our scientists can study them while they sleep." "You will do no such thing," Daniel said, and this time there was steel in his voice. "These three are my family now. They came to me when they were helpless, and I will protect them with everything I have. You want to take them to some sterile laboratory where they will be treated like specimens. You will have to go through me first." Laughed a harsh and mocking sound. "Through you, a single human against the might of the Empire. Do not make me laugh." He gestured to a group of security officers who had been standing along the wall. They stepped forward and began moving toward Daniel, their intentions clear. They would simply take the hatchlings by force and deal with any political consequences later. But they had made a serious mistake. They had underestimated what they were dealing with. Blaze watched them approach with eyes that burned like dying suns. When the first officer reached out to grab Daniel's arm, she spread her tiny wings and opened her mouth. A blast of stellar fire erupted from her throat, so intense and so hot that it vaporized the floor at the officer's feet. The officers stumbled backward in shock, their armor smoking from the near miss. The entire council chamber went silent. Everyone stared at the tiny dragon on Daniel's shoulder, suddenly understanding that she was far more dangerous than her small size suggested. "She missed on purpose," Daniel said quietly. "I would not push your luck." His eyes narrowed with barely contained fury. "You dare to threaten representatives of the Empire." "I dare to protect my family," Daniel replied, "and so do they." Luna and Comet had risen as well, their scales glowing with inner fire and their eyes fixed on the officers with unmistakable warning. They were small and young, but they were still beings of stellar fire and cosmic power, and they would not allow anyone to harm their guardian. High Chancellor finally spoke, his deep voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Enough. This discussion has gone too far. The hatchlings have made their choice clear, and we will respect it. Daniel Hayes of Earth will remain their guardian until such time as they decide otherwise. Any attempt to separate them will be considered an act of aggression against the species and will be treated accordingly." Looked like he wanted to argue, but even he knew better than to challenge the High Chancellor directly. He shot Daniel a look of pure hatred and then turned and stormed out of the chamber, his security officers following behind him. Daniel let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. His legs were shaking, and his heart was pounding so hard he thought it might burst out of his chest. He had just stood up to one of the most powerful empires in the galaxy, and somehow he had survived. Luna nuzzled his cheek gently, and he felt a wave of comfort and love flowing from her small body. Comet chirped happily, and Blaze settled back onto his shoulder with a satisfied rumble. They had protected him, and he had protected them. That was what family did. Ambassador approached him with a warm smile on her crystal face. "You did well, Daniel Hayes. You showed more courage than many beings twice your size and 10 times your age. The chose wisely." Daniel managed a weak laugh. "I was terrified the entire time." "Courage is not the absence of fear," replied. "It is doing what must be done despite the fear. That is something humans seem to understand very well." She was right about that, Daniel thought. Humans had been facing their fears since the beginning of their existence. They had fought predators and survived ice ages and built civilizations from nothing. Being scared was just part of being human. But so was standing up for those you loved, no matter the cost. Part 5: A New Dawn. 1 year had passed since Daniel Hayes found 3 strange eggs at a flea market and changed the course of galactic history. His life had transformed in ways he never could have imagined, but in many ways, he was still the same man he had always been. He no longer lived in his small apartment in Denver. The Galactic Council had arranged for a beautiful estate on the outskirts of the city, with plenty of open land where the growing hatchlings could stretch their wings and practice their flying. Species from across the galaxy had contributed to the construction, wanting to honor the man who had brought hope back to the universe. Luna, Comet, and Blaze were now the size of large dogs, their scales gleaming with colors that seemed to contain entire galaxies. They could fly for hours without resting and breathe fire hot enough to melt steel. But despite their growing power, they still slept curled up on Daniel's chest every night, just as they had when they were tiny hatchlings barely larger than his hand. Daniel had been given the official title of Guardian of the Resurgence by the Galactic Council. It was a position of great honor and responsibility, though he often joked that his main job was still changing bandages and holding hands. He had not stopped working as a nurse. He split his time between his duties at the hospital and his duties as a guardian, because both roles were about the same thing in the end: taking care of those who needed him. But the most remarkable development had nothing to do with Daniel himself. As news of how the hatchlings had been awakened spread across the galaxy, humans on Earth began to look more closely at the strange stones and unusual geological specimens in their own possession. And one by one, they began to find eggs that had been hidden in plain sight for centuries. The eggs were everywhere, once people knew what to look for. They sat in museum collections labeled as rare minerals. They gathered dust in antique shops and private collections. They lay in riverbeds and cave systems where they had been mistaken for ordinary rocks. They had scattered their eggs widely, hoping that someday, somewhere, the right beings would find them. And now those beings were finding them. Amy was a nurse in Seattle who worked in the pediatric ward. She found 2 eggs among her late grandmother's possessions and held them against her heart while caring for sick children through long night shifts. They hatched 3 weeks later, and she named them Hope and Grace. Cole was a firefighter in Atlanta who discovered an egg in the rubble of a collapsed building. He carried it inside his jacket for 3 days while coordinating rescue efforts, never once putting it down. It hatched on the 4th day, and he named the little dragon Phoenix. Park was a 3rd-grade teacher in New York who found an egg being used as a paperweight in her school's storage room. She kept it on her desk and let her students take turns holding it during story time. When it hatched, the entire class voted to name the dragon Stardust. Within a year, there were over 200 confirmed hatchlings on Earth, with more being discovered every month. Scientists and researchers from across the galaxy were stunned. They had searched for centuries without success, and now humans were awakening eggs almost by accident. But it was not an accident at all. The eggs had been waiting for the right species all along. They had been waiting for beings who loved fiercely and cared deeply and gave their hearts to strangers without hesitation. They had been waiting for humanity. Ambassador visited Daniel on the 1-year anniversary of their first meeting. She found him sitting in his garden, watching Luna, Comet, and Blaze chase each other through the afternoon sky. They moved like living flames, leaving trails of light behind them as they twisted and dove and played. "The Council has been discussing humanity's application for membership," said, settling onto a bench beside him. "There was considerable resistance at first. Many species still considered your kind to be too young and too emotional for galactic society." Daniel smiled without looking away from his dragons. "And now?" "Now the resistance has faded considerably. It is difficult to argue that humans are unworthy when they have done what no other species could do, when they have brought back the through nothing more than the warmth of their hearts." Comet swooped down and landed on Daniel's shoulder, chirping happily and nuzzling his cheek. Even at her current size, she still insisted on perching on him whenever possible. Daniel reached up and scratched her under the chin, earning a contented rumble. "We are still the same species we always were," he said. "We still fight wars and make mistakes and let our emotions get the better of us. We are not perfect by any stretch of the imagination." Nodded slowly. "No, you are not. But perfection was never what they were searching for. They were searching for something much more rare and much more precious." She turned to look at him directly. They were searching for beings who would love them unconditionally, beings who would sacrifice for strangers and fight for family and give their hearts without expecting anything in return. Luna landed gracefully on Daniel's other shoulder, and Blaze settled on his head like a living crown of fire. The three dragons radiated warmth and contentment, their bond with their guardian strong and unbreakable. "Your species has spent centuries feeling small and insignificant in the vastness of the cosmos," continued. "You worried that you were too primitive, too young, too flawed to stand among the elder races, but they looked into the hearts of every species in the galaxy, and they found most of them wanting. Only in humanity did they find what they were searching for." She smiled, and her crystal form glowed with genuine warmth. Not power, not intelligence, not technological advancement, just the simple, beautiful capacity to love without limits. That is the rarest gift in the universe, Daniel, and your species has it in abundance. Daniel sat quietly for a moment, absorbing her words. He thought about all the humans across the world who were now caring for their own hatchlings. Nurses and firefighters and teachers and parents. Ordinary people who had become extraordinary simply by doing what came naturally to them. They had not changed who they were. They had not become something different or better. They had simply been themselves, and that had been enough. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson and deep purple. The colors reminded Daniel of his dragons, of the way their scales shimmered with the light of distant stars. "I never expected any of this," he said softly. "I was just tired after work. I just wanted something warm to hold." Laughed gently. "And that is exactly why the eggs chose you. You did not seek power or glory or importance. You simply sought comfort and connection. That is the most human thing of all." Blaze shifted on top of his head and let out a small burst of flame into the evening air. Luna and Comet added their own flames, and for a moment the sky above Daniel blazed with light. The embers of an ancient fire were burning bright once more. They were returning, and they had chosen humanity as their partners. Not because humans were the strongest or the most advanced species in the galaxy, but because humans knew how to love. And in a universe that could be cold and dark and lonely, that made all the difference. Daniel stood up, his three dragons clinging to him with comfortable familiarity. He walked back toward his house, ready to make dinner, and then settle in for another night with three warm bodies curled up on his chest. He was still just a nurse from Denver. He was still just an ordinary man who tried to help people when he could. But now he was also something more. He was proof that the smallest acts of kindness could change the course of history. He was proof that love could awaken miracles. And he was the first human to be called the Dragon's Heart, a title that would be remembered for as long as the stars continued to burn.